Hello.
Fly me to the moon. Blah, 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 blah.
I can hear you sing. I can hear you sing.
Thank you, thank you. I'll be here all week.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
The Web Platform Podcast is a proud media sponsor of DevFest 2015. DevFest is a conference with great sessions and code labs on Android, wearables, Polymer, AngularJS, Google Cloud Platform, Meteor, and many others. Show host Danny Blue and I, Eric Isaacson, will be speakers at this event, and we'd love to meet you all there, so come hang out with us in Dulles, Virginia. Yes, this event will be held at AOL headquarters in Dulles, Virginia, Friday, September 11th and Saturday, September 12th, 2015. For event registration details, check out devfestdc.org and click on the Eventbrite link. Hope to see you there. Do you want to attend a conference with top-level Angular speakers, but you can't afford the cost or the inconvenience of traveling? Well, Angular Remote Conf is an online conference September 24th through September 25th with live interactions, a dedicated forum, respected leaders in the Angular community, and best of all, you never have to leave the comfort of your own home to attend. The Web Platform Podcast listeners receive a 20% discount for Angular Remote Conf. All you have to do is use Web Platform, that's WEBPLATFORM, as the coupon code at checkout, and you get 20% off. And this works for group tickets, standard tickets, and early bird tickets. Head on over to angularremoteconf.com. That's ANGULARREMOTECONF. That's angularremoteconf, all one word, .com, and sign up ASAP to get the maximum amount of savings.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. This is episode number 58, Scalable Vector Graphics. We have on the panel Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
Danny Blue. And myself, Eric Isaacson. And our guest today is Sara. Sara, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you've been doing with SVG?
Oh, that's the most difficult part. Hi everyone. So my name is Sara Soueidan. This is how it's pronounced. Most people don't really know how it's pronounced because it doesn't even look like how it's written. I'm a web developer. Basically, that just describes all of it. I'm also a writer and a speaker. I love writing tutorials in general. I love breaking down complex topics into very simple ones ever since I was in school. And so I've been doing that a lot. My favorite topics have been CSS and SVG in the past couple of years. So I've been doing a lot of speaking and writing about these topics. And that's just it. Yeah, I'm boring like that.
No, SVG is far from boring, and CSS is fantastic. We had Tab Atkins on for an episode, and he was sharing some stuff with us that was mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Pretty awesome.
He has been doing a lot of amazing work with Fantasy. Am I pronouncing her name correctly?
Sure, yes. Absolutely. So what is SVG? Why was it created, and what are the pros and cons, versus something like a bitmap, which is, like PNG files or TIFF files or JPEGs and all that? Now,
why was it created? I'm not sure. I think it's because, just to make using scalable vector graphics easier on the internet. Before SVG, there was VML, which is Vector Markup Language or something. That was a Microsoft thing, and it was supported in old versions of IE before it was ditched in favor of SVG. It has a lot of advantages. Like, wait a minute, I could just grab my smashing book chapter and start reading what I wrote there, literally.
There's chapter reading. I like it.
There's a lot to list.
We should do an episode on VML and Flash.
Yeah. I wasn't around at the time of Flash, so a lot of times when people talk about Flash, I'm like, okay, I did not know that. I didn't know anything about it. I wasn't a developer back then.
Well, we've had to support IE8 on a lot of projects at previous places I've been at, and IE8 doesn't support SVG out of the box, so VML was a necessity. So we had to look for charting libraries like HiCharts and stuff like that would actually render it separately, because VML is basically the same as SVG with some minor differences, kind of like JScript versus JavaScript in the Microsoft world.
I actually like some of the stuff that VML had that SVG didn't. I was reading an article about the differences between these two, and it said that VML was built as an extension to HTML, but SVG is a completely different specification. And VML had stuff like, for example, relative positioning. Like if you would position something inside of another element and then move that parent element, everything would move with it. We don't have that in SVG now. VML also apparently had text wrapping, which you also don't have in SVG now unless you use a foreign object. So yeah, VML really does look interesting.
Old ideas always come back in new forms.
Yeah, I don't know if there's going to be any kind of text wrapping in SVG 2, and I don't think we're going to get relative positioning. So these things are still missing right now. Mm-hmm.
So how are people using SVG? Like what is the advantages?
What are people using it for, and what are the advantages? Advantages are a lot. The number one, the thing that first attracted me personally to SVG was that it's an image that you can control via code. This is my favorite part about it. So if you have an image, for example, if you have a JPEG and you have anything inside of it that you want to animate, you just can't do that. But with SVG, you can have an image and you can animate that image any way you want, animate parts of it. It's going to look crisp and great everywhere. It's interactive and animatable. I already mentioned that. It's text-based, so it can be gzipped easily, and it has much smaller file sizes than its PNG and JPEG counterparts. So it has been, I think it's mostly being used today for stuff like animated illustrations in general. A great use case for that is HTML5 banners or SVG-only banners, which is currently becoming a thing. I even wrote an article for NetMag about this topic, which I finished a couple of days ago. People are also using it a lot for sprites as a replacement for icon fonts. And generally, for example, in a recent client project of mine, there were just some simple illustrations which were suitable, which were a perfect candidate for SVG. If you have an illustration, it's a perfect candidate for SVG. So we used SVG, and we didn't have to worry about providing 1x, 2x, or 3x alternatives for different screen resolutions. So yeah, it's basically illustrations, animated illustrations, data visualizations, sometimes icon fonts, stuff like that.
When I used SVG, it was usually an Illustrator, where I would create an Illustrator object, and then I would export to SVG. And typically when I've built out icon fonts, with a lot of the projects that are online, like IcoMoon, or there's lots of them out there now. But you create your own using SVG, and what I found was the tools that I used didn't format everything correctly. So I would have to go in and adjust manually the viewBox and adjust, these different pieces of the SVG to conform it to whatever, subset of SVG that this particular library wanted. Have you encountered a lot of this? Do you know tools that help out with that?
I've never had to adjust the viewBox manually unless I wanted to scale SVG or change something inside of it. But like you said, the output that we get from most graphics editors, especially from Illustrator, is not really optimal. It is going to get better, which is great news, but I don't know when or what features are going to be added or not. There's a lot of junk code exported with it. Sometimes, depending on what you're doing, well, I can't talk about all graphics editors like that because Inkscape is pretty good at exporting SVGs as long as you choose the optimized SVG options, because otherwise you're going to get a lot of metadata. But Illustrator, I don't know. I think I've never had any viewBox problems from Illustrator before, no.
I think it was mostly because the library required that you have all of them the same size for these icons so that it can actually piece them together in a font file.
Yeah, well, you could create multiple artboards for that and then export those artboards, and they would be exported as individual SVGs. And depending on the size that you specify in Illustrator, you would end up with, that size. So if you create multiple same size artboards and you export them, you're going to get that size too.
So I found some of the challenges with working with web components, like, and I know that web components are new, and so it's not related to SVGs so much, but trying to actually extend. Basically, a lot of the web components features depend on HTML element prototype, and SVG is not HTML element, obviously. So when you try to extend it, it does not work. So it doesn't get all the lifecycle benefits and all that. that you would if you were to turn it into a component and extend it further. So some of the features that are in SVG, like defs and use and things like that really are kind of akin to template and some other pieces of web components. It would be nice, like, if we were to have something that worked with HTML a little bit closer to HTML than XML. I don't know what I'm getting at specifically, but
yeah, I was just trying to figure that out.
There is a question there at some point, somewhere. But
like, what's the how would you compare, for example, use and defs with template or?
Well, why would I not use something like with Canvas or something where it's an HTML element, and then I can extend that and have certain API with it to make it a specific canvas to draw, rather than SVG. Obviously, scale is a big thing. So, but are there any other reasons?
I don't know. Like, you're getting me a little out of my league here because I've never used web components before. I'm not exactly like an expert about how they work, what can be done and what cannot be done. So I don't think I should be giving an opinion about something I don't really know about.
That's fair enough.
Well, I think it goes to the fact that I think what you're getting at is that, with things like Canvas, where I can draw and I can compartmentalize my, my graphic, and I could do that either not necessarily so much in the DOM, but rather in JavaScript. Let's draw a circle on Canvas, and then I use that as opposed to an SVG. There's a marked difference, right? SVG gives you a significant amount more tooling than simply I want to draw something on a canvas using JavaScript and a canvas tag. I think that's what you're getting at, yes? Like, what are the differences between those two things?
Well, SVG is way more accessible even than Canvas because, the content of the canvas is not really in the DOM, so you can't access it. I read an article in NetMag once that explained that there are some features that are coming that will help you provide accessible content for a canvas, but then you would have to maintain two sets of content, the one that you're drawing on the canvas and the one that you're going to place between the opening and closing canvas tags. And then comes the point where you have to maintain some kind of relationship between them so that the screen reader knows which element, for example, has been interacted with on the canvas, and then reflect that in the DOM between the opening and closing canvas tags. That would be a lot of work, in my opinion, and that's where SVG has an advantage over Canvas.
Obviously, SVG does have a lot of those advantages, and we've talked about authoring, and we've talked about sort of the challenges within sort of the SVG to HTML world. I mean, style, at the end of the day, you still want to necessarily be able to style those SVG elements. I mean, Has style gotten easier with, is style this horrible thing that, you have to do in SVG? Like, is it a simple thing that can be done, that can be made accessible to web developers without a great deal of work, so to say?
Yes, but the resources are currently limited. For example, you can style SVGs using CSS, just like you would with HTML, except that it has some extra attributes, SVG-specific attributes. But not all of these attributes can be set in CSS. In SVG2, the list is growing. For example, right now, you cannot change the width and the height and the position of an SVG element in CSS. It's just not possible. But SVG2, and I think this is currently available in Chrome Canary, you can test that there. So the list is growing. We will be able to style SVG elements more in CSS in the future. And then there's some other limitation, which is also dependent on a future CSS technology, styling the contents of use. Because when you use an element using the used element, the contents of the element that you're using are going to be cloned into a shadow DOM. And, you can't really access a shadow DOM with CSS just like you would access a normal DOM. So that brings up a big challenge, especially because, for example, for most icon systems that are currently in use today, is they either use inline SVG if and when they can, and most of the times they just use the use element because it helps you to reuse elements on the page in different places without having to copy-paste the same code multiple times. So we can style the contents of a use element, but we currently need CSS variables to do that. we only have one variable in CSS, which is current color, and we can use that to do some very limited styling of the content of the use. But to get complete control over styling of that shadow DOM inside of views, we need CSS variables, and these are not supported today. They're only supported in Firefox. So we have to wait for those before we get the real control that we want.
On that note, do you recommend playing with these things using Myth.io or some other polyfill for this? Because it's only, the thing about the polyfills is it scopes it to the root. So you can't do like the nested scoping that's part of that spec. But other than that, you could simulate it for, to some degree.
I don't know. I haven't tried that yet, but it's a good idea to explore, actually.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have some growing pains with the variables too, because how do we name those? Do we namespace them? Because you're going to have, let's say you have multiple SVGs and you're using somebody else's SVG, and that uses some different variables. Now you have 5,000 variables in your file. It becomes overwhelming. So
absolutely, yeah.
So it's like, how do you name those? How do you structure them? That's all going to be challenges for us. But I'm really glad we got rid of the hammers for shadow DOM, like /deep/ and : shadow, stuff like that. Polymer for web components has a nice way of using the CSS variables for theirs, and that's how they get their web components to work like that. So they're going that route, and they've mimicked the spec to that degree.
So I'm curious, like SVG has a great deal of use on the web today.
Yes.
It's not necessarily the SVG we remember where it didn't work in IE8, or it's a lot different now. Like, what are some of the really interesting use cases you've seen out there where people have done some really cool stuff with SVG that maybe web developers should know about, so that they go, oh, maybe I should relook at SVG again?
Well, icon systems are one thing. And this new trend that I was talking about before, which is HTML5 and SVG banners, this is really, really interesting. Because Flash it's being killed practically, because it's blocked in Firefox. It's going to be intelligently blocked by Chrome in the future too. So it doesn't really. I think it's pretty much dying. Flash is dying. So we need an alternative. And HTML5 animations with SVG are a perfect candidate for that. So for the article that I wrote for NetMap last week, I did create an animated banner, and I really, really liked it. The same thing. Icon systems, banners, ad banners, and animated illustrations and infographics. Infographics are great. SVGs are great for infographics. Again, I did that for a client project too, and it was perfect. Like the infographic, we embedded it using Object, for example, and the text inside of it was real text, so it was accessible to screen readers, and we used web fonts, so we were able, instead of having to convert the text into outlines, which is what a lot of people do, but I don't really recommend a lot. It just depends on the use cases. The text was accessible by screen readers. It was selectable and searchable by the user. It was perfect, but you get all of the advantages of the infographic, but also the advantages mixed with the advantages of SVG, accessibility, searchability, and stuff like that. And to top all of that, you get to provide a fallback between the opening and closing object tag, which the fallback that I prefer to provide, instead of providing a PNG fallback, for example, I provided the data inside of the infographic. We just put it as text in there. It's amazing. SVG is really, really great for infographics, ad banners, icon systems, animated graphics in general. If you have any image and you want to animate parts of that image, and that image can be embedded as an SVG, for example, continuous tone images like photographs are not a good candidate for SVG, and you're probably not going to want to animate that. Like, who would want to animate a river or a mountain in a photo, right? So if you have any image that you want to animate parts of, also SVG is also a great candidate for that. And I've seen these kinds of examples not just in development. I saw them in real life websites, and they're just great.
So you've talked about, the animation aspect of it. Now, there's a lot of changes sort of in the web platform when it comes to animation for these really cool things that we want to do, both with SVG and CSS. Where you have things like Smile, which is, if I'm not mistaken, still leaving Blink. And you have CSS animation, which isn't quite all the way there yet. I mean, how do you get to that point where you're getting the sorts of animations you want on the web with SVG?
I use JavaScript. Smell it's officially pronounced smile, but I don't get it. I mean, there's no E in the end. Smil is dying. It's not going to be implemented in IE or Edge ever. It's going out of Chrome, so it has no future. So we have to use either CSS or the Web Animations API when it is here, and it's currently not. So we just use JavaScript or CSS. But CSS animations on SVG are extremely limited. Like I said, not all of the properties can be set in CSS, so hence they can't all be animated in CSS. So not all kinds of animations can be achieved with CSS. And then there is some versions of Internet Explorer don't support animations and transitions, keyframes on SVG elements. Edge does, but it still does not support transforms on SVG elements. So that is a huge drawback too. So I personally don't use CSS to animate SVGs. I use JavaScript. And if I have to choose a library to do that, because I wouldn't do that using vanilla.js, I prefer using GreenSock or Snap SVG. And GreenSock has been my favorite lately because it has some really, really amazing features like sequencing, controlling the timing. It's just perfect.
What is the performance for something like GreenSock animating SVG on mobile?
It's not the best, but it's not GreenSock's fault. It's not GreenSock. Like the performance of GreenSock is really great. It's perfect. But SVG animation on mobile in general sucks. So whether you're using JavaScript or CSS, and like I said, even if you want to use CSS, sometimes you just can't. Like if you want to animate a path from one shape to another, you can't do that with CSS. You're going to have to use JavaScript.
Okay. Something we've mentioned a couple times already is defs, and so I'm very much so a novice when it comes to SVG stuff. Like any SVG work I've done, it has been done with something like D3. So I haven't really thought about it. I've just learned D3. Don't really care what it creates. But the idea of defs was something that was really, really interesting to me when I did see it. Can you explain a little bit what defs are for SVG?
Yeah, defs. It's an element that is used to define, which it's short for define or definitions. You define stuff that is not going to be rendered on the screen. For example, if you want to define a linear gradient or a clip path or anything that you don't want to render on the screen or apply to any element. So you define the linear gradient, for example, inside a defs element, so it does not get rendered, and then you use that linear gradient anywhere you want. For example, you could use it as a fill for a stroke fill on a certain element. You could, for example, in the icon system world, before symbol, there's symbol right now, but before symbol, we used to use defs. So we would define all of the icons inside defs, and then we would embed them or use them wherever we want on the screen, not on the screen, on the page, using use. So you would have all of the definitions inside defs. They're not going to render. It's practically kind of effectively like a template in this sense, except that there's no shadow DOM or not anything related to that. You just define whatever you want and then use it wherever you want, multiple times, just one time, like that.
Okay, awesome. So that's okay. That makes total sense, and it's very cool. And I see now why the template tag was kind of brought up when it was mentioned earlier. But no, that's pretty cool. I had no idea that was a thing.
Yeah, when I was watching your talk, that was the first time I think I saw your talk from Düsseldorf.
Mm-hmm.
That was really cool. And then you talked about using defs to do like spriting for SVG. So
yes.
I had never done this, but I've seen some articles on it. But I think your talk really clicked for me, like where I understood it finally.
That's great to hear.
Can you explain a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, it's just like I mentioned right now. So you have a set of icons that you could create in Illustrator, for example. Okay, and then you export those icons. You have multiple files. Each file represents an icon. So what you do is you take the code for each of these icons, put it inside a group element, and then you put all of these groups, all of these icons, inside a defs element. The defs element, you have an SVG, a root SVG, and you put all of the icon definitions inside of it, inside a defs element. So you have root SVG, defs, and then G's, a bunch of groups, one group for each icon. Okay, so this is the sprite sheet. This is going to be the sprite sheet. Now you can have the sprite sheet be inside of your page, or you can have it be external. So yeah, basically you have the spreadsheet, you have the definitions of the icons inside of it, and then you use the use element to place any icon that you want anywhere on the page. This is how spriting. This is actually one of the multiple SVG spriting techniques. It's not my personal favorite, but this is how it would work. But even though we can do that, like you have defs, and inside of defs you have a G, which contains the elements of an icon. Instead of using defs plus G, you can use the symbol element. And the symbol element combines both the functionality of the defs, because anything inside of a symbol is not going to be rendered on the screen initially. And it combines also the functionality of G, because it's used to group elements. So you'd have a symbol, an SVG. The SVG would have a number of symbols inside of it. Each symbol is an icon, contains the elements of an icon, and then you would use the symbol using the use element anywhere on the page.
That's really awesome, actually. And I know you talked about how some older versions of Internet Explorer don't support it, and you had to do like inline. You had to do you had to do an inline SVG and then do some other thing to make it work.
True, but Edge is the latest updates to Edge include using SVG, external SVG.
That's
for
awesome
spriting. Yes, it is. Actually, my favorite SVG spriting technique is a different one, which uses. Okay, so it's fragment identifiers. There's like. Okay, this is going to get me into more complex subjects, so I'll wait till we mention viewBox before I get into this one. Okay, so we'll just forget I said anything.
So tell us about viewBox.
viewBox sounds interesting.
It is, I like to call it SVG superpowers. And I'm pretty sure you know that. viewBox it's the attribute that's responsible for scaling the contents of the SVG. I like to think of it as, it's pretty hard to explain like this. I have an interactive demo that I usually use to explain how it works. So in SVG you have viewport, the viewBox, and then you have a preserve aspect ratio attribute. All right. The viewport is it's pretty much the same as the viewport of an iframe, because effectively an SVG is kind of like an iframe when it is embedded in line in a page. Okay. So the viewport is the area on the screen where the SVG is going to be rendered, and it's defined by the width and the height of the SVG. Now the viewBox is the actual coordinate system that is used inside of the SVG to position elements and to scale them and transform them and everything. Initially, when you create an SVG in Illustrator and export it, the viewBox is identical to the viewport. So you have, for example, if we're talking 600 by 800 SVG, the viewBox is going to be 00, 600, 800. The 00 represents the top left corner of the SVG of the viewBox, which is the center of the coordinate system, and 600 by 800 is the dimensions. Now you can use the viewBox to do a lot of stuff. Like you can scale, for example, you can zoom in. You can zoom into the SVG, zoom out of it, make it bigger, make it smaller. And sometimes if you change the viewBox, for example, if you change the values of the viewBox and it has a different aspect ratio than that of the viewport, you're going to end up with some white space on either side of the SVG. And then you can use that space to position the contents of the SVG inside of the viewport. It's slightly complicated if you talk about it without any visuals to explain, to go with them.
Basically, though, these are just techniques to position it, because it has relative positioning, right? It's like sort of, not, it doesn't have relative, rather. Mm. It's just sort of like absolute, but there's no Z index. So to me, it's very difficult to figure out how to position these things, where the coordinates go. Sort of manually create these is difficult. I couldn't just sit down and code an SVG icon. I'd have to use some visual representation for myself. There are people smarter than me that I'm sure could do that.
No, I think we all do. We all use visual editors, because we can, for example, even if you could create polygons or rectangles or circles manually, it's not as easy to draw an SVG path using manually writing SVG path data. That's not easy, and I've not heard of anyone who does it manually yet.
I'm sure there's someone out there, some crazy person.
If you can hear us, please reach out and let us know.
Yes,
we would love to know your secret.
Definitely would love to know. Tell us your story.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that in some of your examples, you use scripts. And scripts and different HTML elements require some namespaces to work.
Yes. Yes.
So why is this, and what are some gotchas we need to look out with that?
There's one gotcha that always got me, and I'm going to mention it second. The first thing is that the XML-NS, which is the XML namespace attribute, you only need it if the SVG is not embedded in line. Actually, you can remove it. I should have said it the opposite way. You can remove the XML namespace if the SVG is embedded in line in an HTML5 document. It has to be an HTML5 document. All right. Now, there are other namespaces. For example, one of them is the xlink. It's XML namespace : xlink. Okay. So this is the namespace for any. So you have XML-NS, the XML namespace, and then you have XML-NS : xlink. There's a difference between these two. Basically, the thing that you have to remember all of the time, if you have any kind of linking inside of the SVG, whether you're linking to something external or you're doing internal linking, like if you have something I mentioned before, like if you've defined a linear gradient and you are referencing it somewhere in the SVG, you would reference it using the URL syntax. Anytime you have any kind of linking inside of the SVG, you need to make sure that you have the XML namespace xlink attribute set, because most of the time, not most of the times, like 99.99% of the times that I've tried it, it just doesn't work if you don't have this namespace. So if you have any kind of linking, make sure you have that one. The XML namespace, you don't have it if you don't need it if you're embedding the SVG in line in an HTML5 document. Other things that I learned were, for example, attribute names. This doesn't really have a lot to do with the namespacing directly, but for example, if you're linking to a script from inside of an SVG document, instead of having script source, you would have script xlink : href. So it's stuff like this, attributes, and when to add this and when to remove that.
It's just because of how the browser identifies the document itself, the SVG piece or fragment, document fragment, whatever you want to call it. It just doesn't have access to certain things that we take for granted, like source or href and things that are HTML related, because SVG doesn't extend HTML like we said. So that makes sense to me. One of the things too that I've done to avoid linking, because I've had lots of problems before and I struggled for hours and hours trying to figure it out. I wish I saw your talk way before that, but it didn't happen way before that. But one of the things that I did was, like with background images, I would do base64 encoding. And so I would take the SVG and base64 it, and that would embed it so I wouldn't have to link to it. Is there any problems you've encountered with that? Obviously, I mean, I couldn't reuse it. I had to remake it again if I wanted to change the file. So that's a clear disadvantage. But is there any other?
I'm not a big fan of base64 encoding in general. I've never done it myself. It's not also best for performance. There have been a lot of researchers, some of which said that it's bad, some of which said it's not really that bad. But it's generally not recommended, especially that if you're going to embed the gzip and SVG, if it's base64, it's always going to be bigger in size than if it's not gzipped, if it's not base64 encoded.
Yeah, in my cases, I needed like a certain pseudo encapsulation, I guess, but I couldn't reference things outside of it, so that was my use case. But I can see that being a problem where the rendering of it, because then it has to parse it and then parse it again. So I can see some problems happening. So what about libraries and frameworks that you really like to use?
I'm not generally a big fan of frameworks. I don't use them, not even in CSS, so I'm not sure about that. But library-wise, I like GreenSock for animation. Snap SVG is also great. D3.js is also very popular among a lot of developers, but I've never personally used it myself. Pretty much only these. I don't use any kind of libraries other than that, except for jQuery, which I rarely ever use.
Yeah, we're having somebody come on for jQuery 3, but I haven't used jQuery in a long time.
Me neither.
The DOM has kind of grown a little bit since the dollar get this element. But I'm interested to hear what's changed in jQuery off topic.
Yeah, there were also some changes regarding SVG support. It's gotten better. Because you currently cannot, for example, manipulate an SVG element or create one or change class names or do stuff like that. And jQuery, it just doesn't work because jQuery was not prepared for this kind of thing. But there was this addition a while back. I can't remember the details, but basically SVG support got a little better than jQuery.
So recently I had to do some graphing solutions with data visualization. And so I've researched a lot of that and went to different frameworks and libraries. One of the things I encountered, SVG, the performance was not as good as Canvas and WebGL. Because I needed like I don't know, like 10,000 nodes, and to render that with SVG was like painful. Have you ever encountered any of these heavy visualization things? Have you found solutions for these? If you have,
no, personally, no. I've never done any kind of work like heavy as that. No.
That's a lot of nodes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was. I mean, the typical average was about 1 to 2,000, which Canvas handles fine, and SVG is kind of at its end with that. So I had to either use a WebGL with a Canvas fallback, and SVG I couldn't use, which I wanted to use initially because of its accessibility and because I was familiar with D3 already.
Well, I think that just goes to the best tool for job sort of case. I mean,
oh, for sure.
Obviously, I think with things like SVG, obviously we have options on the web. The beauty of it is you get to choose which option. SVG may not be the best use case for that tool, even though we want to use it for those sorts of things. Obviously, WebGL has a learning curve, even if you're using something like 3 or related sort of frameworks or libraries.
Yeah, and 3 to me, like I was just saying before, is pretty much like the D3 for WebGL, like where it's very, very low level, right? And then you need to build your own abstractions on top, or you need to find something else that's built on top of 3. So sorry to go off subject, Sarah.
No, it's perfectly fine. I'm enjoying it.
So, I mean, in SVG too, we talked about defs, we talked about use, we talked about some of these other things. These are things that I didn't really know existed in SVG until I started reading and studying a little more recently. And
you should read more of my articles, by the way.
Yes, I really should. I've been bad about that.
Yeah, Eric, get on it. What are you doing?
I listen to all your podcasts.
Oh, really? Well, you
not
should
all
do
of
that.
them. Not all of them, but most of them. The one thing that stuck out to me was from one of the talks too was the switch. And
switch in SVG is awesome.
Yes. Yeah, and is it performant? Is it because? I mean, can you explain it and talk a little bit about it, I guess?
I don't know why it wouldn't be performant, but to explain it, it's actually part of the SVG document structure specification. And I'm totally reading out of my chapter right now, by the way. So it defines elements and attributes. It's actually the switch element. It has attributes like required features, required extensions, and system language. It gives us the ability to specify alternate viewing depending on the capabilities of a given user agent or the user's language. Conditional processing attributes can only affect the direct rendering of elements and do not prevent elements from being successfully referenced by other elements. So they are similar to display property and to the display property in that respect. Now, these attributes of the switch element, they act as tests and they return either true or false. And because of that, we can use them to test whether a browser supports a certain feature or not. And depending on whether it supports it or not, we can provide a different fallback. For example, it can be used. IE does not support foreign object. I'm not sure. I think, I don't know if Edge does or will very soon in the future. But let's talk about IE, not Edge. It does not support foreign objects. So we can use the SVG switch element to test for whether or not it is supported and then provide alternative fallback depending on that. For example, you would have an SVG which contains a switch element. The switch element would start with a use referencing some SVG icon. Okay, this is the way spriting currently works in SVG, or one of the spriting techniques works. So you have switch. The first child of switch is the use element, which is referencing whatever SVG icon that we want. Okay, the second element would be the foreign object, and inside of the foreign object would be a div, it's basically just a div, and it has a class name, for example, icon fallback, and you would style this div in CSS, and if the icon fallback, you'll give it a PNG version of the icon that you were first referencing in use. Am I making sense?
Totally. And when you said that, my eyes got wide and I smiled. It was great.
Great.
because testing, I love stuff like that where, you can put stuff in there that's very, very low. It's high impact and low cost.
Yeah, the div, which is just basic HTML, is going to be rendered in IE, but not in SVG-capable browsers, because these browsers will understand the use element and they will reference the icon that the use is referencing, which is the SVG. So yeah, SVG for browsers that support it and non-SVG for browsers that don't.
That's really awesome. What's next? I mean, have you been working with some of the SVG2 stuff? Are you on the working group? Have you played around with some of the concepts?
I'm not on the working group, no, but I'm not sure. I try to keep up as much as possible, but I'm pretty sure that I'm missing a lot of stuff. For example, we are going to get Z-index in SVG2, which is fantastic. We're going to get more properties. These are the things that I care about the most, and so I know that they're coming, but I'm pretty sure that there are other features that I'm missing. We're not going to get relative positioning because I don't know if they will ever think about this, but right now all we can do is use nested SVGs to mimic that kind of behavior. We're going to get Z-index, we're going to get, not sure about automatic text wrapping, but we can work around that by using foreign object, but then again, this does not work in IE. We're going to get more attributes that we can animate and set in CSS, which is extremely useful.
Yeah, and the CSS tree is totally reversed, isn't it? In SVG, the inheritance tree?
Oh yeah, that's a very good question. By the way, it's not really it's not reversed, but there is one thing. For example, you have an SVG can be styled using an external style sheet. CSS which is defined in an external style sheet, or styles in a style tag in the same document, or styles inside a style attribute on individual elements, or using presentation attributes. Now, just like with HTML, styles inside a style attribute are going to override the styles in a style tag, and these are going to override the styles in an external style sheet. So if when I first started out, the way that I would think about it was, okay, so the more specific you get, the closer or the more you get inside of the element, so to speak, the more the styles become specific and will override whatever comes from the outside. So I thought, okay, there's external, and then there is style, and then there is style attribute, and then there is the property that is an attribute in itself, which is a presentation attribute. So I thought, okay, it only makes sense that the presentation attribute is going to override all of the other styles, right? But it's not the case. It doesn't happen this way.
Yeah, and I think you had a great example where you showed that the attribute style you had was a certain, let's say it was fill color, right? And then you had an embedded style above that had the fill color, and you created some good defaults there, and by doing the style inline and fill color, and then you had an embedded style. Can you tell us how the CSS tree works and how we can utilize that to create like a default value?
The tree is not really literally reversed. There's only one thing that works in an unexpected way. For example, in HTML or even in CSS, even in SVG, what happens is if you have an SVG and you have multiple kinds of styles applied to it. For example, if you have an element inside of an SVG and you have a fill color specified for it in an external style sheet, and then you have a style tag inside of the SVG that also specifies this different fill color on the element. And then you have a style attribute on the element with a fill color. And then you have a presentation attribute. So you have 4 different ways you can set the style on an SVG element. Now, when it comes to the cascade, the inline style attribute is going to override the style specified in the style tag. And then the styles and the style tag are going to override the styles in the external style sheet. So when I first started out, the thing that made sense to me back then was, okay, the more we're getting inside of an element, so to speak, the more specific we're going to get, and the styles are going to override any other styles. So I expect the presentation attributes to be much more specific than all other styles, but it was actually not like that. Presentation attributes are overridden by any CSS declaration. The only thing that presentation attributes override is inherited styles on an element. So if the element is inheriting a style from a parent element, and it also has a presentation attribute, the presentation attribute is going to override that inherited style. But it's going to be overridden by any style declaration outside of the SVG or inside of it. And this is, you also mentioned fallback. you can use presentation attributes to provide a sensible fallback for an SVG. An example of this is I've written an article about how you can style the contents of an SVG use element using CSS variables, because they are, as we mentioned before, they're part of the shadow DOM. The way, there's a lot of stuff to talk in that area. Basically, what we can boil down to is keep the presentation attributes, because they will work as a fallback if any other kind of style declaration fails. So a practical example here is if you have an SVG that has a width and a height element. In most cases, a lot of people do, and what I used to do too when I first started with this was, if I wanted to make an SVG responsive, make it fluid, the first thing that I would do, and I would recommend people to do, is to remove the width and the height attributes, and then give it a width 100%. Sometimes you don't even have to do that, but IE does require some hacks to work to make it as responsive as you expect. So right now, what I recommend right now is to keep the width and the height attributes, and then override them in CSS. They are going to be overridden by whatever styles you specify in CSS. So if you want to make it fluid, keep those, and then go to the CSS and just specify width 100% and height whatever you want. Make it fluid in the CSS. This is very useful because if CSS fails for any reason, the styles are not applied, you're going to have something the browser can fall back to. So the SVG does not scale unexpectedly where you don't want it to. On elements, if they don't have, for example, a fill color or a stroke color, the browser is going to use the default black color instead. So if you don't want it to fall back to a ugly black color, it will just use the presentation attributes. And the last thing that I want to mention here is that it's better to keep the width and height attributes on an SVG and then override them in CSS, because if you're using the SVG as a background image in CSS, some browsers, I'm not sure which ones, but they do have a problem scaling the background image if the SVG does not come with a width and height by default, the attributes.
You spoke about layers and how we don't have a Z-index in a lot of your talks. You spoke about this and how we've been voting those up in the user voice for Microsoft's Edge. And we're hoping that we get, SVG Z-index in, or it is in 2.0, right?
Yes, it is, but it's yet to be implemented.
So does that work with hardware acceleration? Is that going to help the performance of this stuff? Are things going to be put on separate layers with Z-index, or is it just the Z-index property?
No, I think it's just the Z-index property. I think that what affects the hardware acceleration is the will change property, because it does create the will change property it creates stacking context. No, that's not directly related. No, it's just a simple Z-index property.
Because it optimizes it for that, right? Depending on what you have.
The will change is used for optimization, but the Z-index, it's not. Actually, performance in SVG, hardware acceleration, is one of the things that browsers need to work on, because a lot of people don't use SVG today because, they have many reasons, but the number one reason that I always hear in conferences is SVG is not ready. It's basically because of a lot of features, the limitations when it comes to styling. This is the number one pain. And I don't usually have any way to defend SVG in this case. If anyone wants to animate or style an SVG inside of a use element, I don't have a workaround for them. So if they said, okay, I need to be able to do this, there's nothing I can say. The only thing I could recommend in that case is to inline your icons inside of the page. Then you have full control over them. But there are still some limitations. There are so many options and so many limitations, again, in SVG that what may work, you're going to have to make some compromises sometimes. And some projects, you can make these compromises, and in some projects you just can't. And if SVG is not capable enough to do whatever you want it to do, then they just don't use it. And which is a pity, because all we need is a little bit more browser support, some performance optimizations. This is the number one on the list. Number two being improving browser support for some future features or even past features which are not fully implemented. So performance is important, because even if you get to use an SVG, which I did in a recent client project, we had pretty nice SVGs and animated, and as soon as my client opened them on mobile, he was like, okay, it took quite some time to animate them. I said, yeah, because SVG animation performance sucks on mobile, and it's even sometimes bad depending on the animation that you're doing, and on some desktop browsers as well. So performance needs to be worked on, hardware acceleration, and then more features.
In my work, sometimes I've had to do some hacks and things to get things to work. Unfortunately, like I don't like to do that, but sometimes you have to get it done, and then you can go and refactor later. Have you found that in some cases will change, or well, I guess will change you can't test now, but like transform z index 0, right? Which will send that to the GPU. Like, could you do that with if you did a defs and some element and then you did a transform on it? Would that actually work to put it on its own layer?
I don't think so. I don't think SVG animations are hardware accelerated at all now, at least not in Chrome. They have slightly better performance in Firefox, but not all of the time. Sometimes they suck in Firefox. Edge is not, well, they all need a lot of improvements, actually.
Is the community really helping to push the vendors to really look at these things with open eyes and say, this is something that maybe isn't on our priority list, but this is something that the community is really wants, and we should provide it for them?
I don't know, because I think the best thing that the community is doing right now is upvoting features on user voice. I don't see the same effort being done for example, Chrome or Firefox. And the thing that I always think about is the whole transform origin problem in Firefox, because we've been nagging about this for a couple of years now, but still no. I think there was someone from Microsoft told me a while back that there has been some work done on it, but it's still not resolved. The community, like I said, most of the community, or some big part of it, still is kind of, they just avoid using SVG because of these. So instead of pushing them forward, which is what I always try to tell them to do, like if you don't use them, if you don't push them forward, they're not gonna become a priority. So yeah, we do need to do better. Sometimes I have to admit, sometimes I feel depressed by all of this, because before I started digging into SVG, I was really, really very much into CSS shapes and exclusions and CSS regions. And I used to talk and write about this a lot. And I think I'm very proud to say that I think that my writing did have something to do with pushing CSS shapes further in Chrome to get all of the support they needed back then. But still, even with all of the stuff that I did, and I felt very, very, very strongly about them, but still, CSS regions were pulled out of Blink, and CSS exclusions haven't gotten any advancements yet. So sometimes I feel like I'm powerless, and sometimes I'm like, no, I have to be stubborn and I have to keep talking about this stuff. So the Edge team have been listening a lot lately when it comes to feature requests, but the others have been slightly slower.
Yeah, exclusions especially. I remember you spoke about that. I think it was with Chris Coyer and Dave Rupert, and that sounded like amazing stuff. I would love to see that. And, Jen Simmons now is doing a lot of talks about shapes.
Exactly.
Which is great. That's really pushing that forward. Regions is still like you said, it's sort of, well, will it be there? Will it not? But I think with Firefox, I've had a few bugs that I needed fixed, and most of them, they're very responsive on there. So if you go to their Bugzilla, you have to comment and keep at it, because unless that there's a need or from the community pushing it, like anybody, at work, if I have a certain priority to do for myself, I'm not gonna do the other thing that's not really getting any traction. So it's our job in the community. I know you do a lot, but it's our job in the community to go and go on to these bugs and comment and add useful information, not complain.
Yeah.
Which is, the initial tendency, I think, is to be like, what the, why isn't this done?
Exactly.
But something constructive. So, and I found Mozilla is very responsive that way. Maybe not within, a couple hours or whatever, which is fine, but usually within 24 hours, there'll be somebody else commenting on that. And if you make sure that you watch the bugs, it'll show up in your email.
Yeah, the only emails they get about bugs are those that I file on CRBug. Because I don't file a lot of Firefox bugs, really.
I don't file a lot either, but I comment on the ones that I'm working on in my own stuff. I'll be like, this has to be fixed somewhere, or I'll see some bug that's referenced in Can I Use or some other site, and I'll go to that bug and I'll be like, oh, this is exactly what I'm talking about. This needs to change. Like, for instance, recently we've been working with Service Worker, and the offline flag in Firefox was overriding, Navigator offline. And so I couldn't tell if it was online or offline. There's no way to show in a demo. And that was fixed fairly quick. It took maybe a week, but to me that's fairly quick because there's a new release.
Is really quick.
I thought that was really good. So, and there was a lot of comments after mine, and I commented several times. So, it was a good effort on their part. So, I mean, we could do that, and I'm not talking just you. I'm saying community, like, everybody. We should do these things. If I do it when it's related to my work, right? So, I should do more.
Yeah, I could seriously. I could use some support in this, because, like I said, sometimes I just feel so depressed, and I'm like, okay, I give up. I'm not gonna even try anymore.
We don't want to depress Sarah, so community, come help, please.
Help.
Send the bug. We'll put the bug in the that particular bug you're talking about. We'll put that in the show notes, and I'll go on there and I'll comment first. And whoever else wants to jump in, feel free.
Mm-hmm. That would be useful.
It's been there for a while. At best, maybe they'll close it and say we won't fix it. At least we'll have an answer.
Yeah. Well, it would really, really, really suck if they didn't fix it.
So, I mean, on CSS stuff, there is stuff, you were talking about, like you said, exclusions and regions.
Mm-hmm.
So, what's next? Are you going to be talking about more CSS stuff in the future?
Yes, I want to, especially that there are some more interesting features like the backdrop filter, which WebKit introduced a while back, actually started supporting now, I think, or is it the next version? The backdrop filter, the element function, which only works in Firefox. So there are some really, really exciting features that are only supported in one browser each. So I would like to help maybe push those forward. I've given up a little bit on CSS shapes because, CSS shapes started out as a way to wrap elements around irregular shapes and inside irregular shapes as well. But then the specification was split into two modules. The first one, which is focusing on wrapping outside a shape, and the second one, which is wrapping inside of the inside shape. So the first one, shape outside, to wrap text around irregular shapes, it now works in WebKit browsers and in Chrome. But shape inside there hasn't been any work on it. And I remember talking to one of the spec editors at CSSConf EU about last year. There are some things that are, let's just say it's just not easy to implement those features, especially when it comes to making them responsive. Because if you have defined a shape and you have some text inside of it, and then you want to make it fluid, the shape is going to change, and so the amount of text inside of it may just not fit anymore. So there are a lot of things that can get complicated here, and a lot of use cases that CSS regions could solve. But then again, there is Google and regions, and really, Google upset me so much by dumping them. Seriously,
by dumping the regions.
Yeah, regions.
Yeah, I think it upset a lot of people, but I'm sure that there's some reasons behind it, and maybe they'll come back to it at some point. Maybe there's a piece missing, like with WebRTC, for instance. There was a piece missing that Microsoft wouldn't agree on, and so then they came out with ORTC, which everyone seems okay. Well, we'll do that now. So maybe that'll happen at some point.
This all reminded me of this whole conversation between PPK and Jake Archibald recently about whether we're moving too fast or we should move even faster than we are now. That was quite an interesting conversation. And I think that both of them have some valid points. Like, I agree with some of PPK's points, and I do agree with Jake's point of view as well. So it's controversial.
Yeah, there's definitely, it's not black or white for sure. It's definitely some gray in there.
Yeah.
It's a great discussion though, because both sides have a very valid way of thinking about it. So if people want to find you, what's your Twitter and your blog, and where can they go to contact you?
They can do it via email or on Twitter. I usually answer faster on Twitter. Now, there are some exceptions sometimes. For example, sometimes TweetDeck literally freezes from the amount of notifications that I get. So if I miss a tweet or if I don't reply to someone, it's most of the times, not all of the times, but most of the times it's because I don't see those tweets at the time that they tweet them. So the most reliable way, if you need anything, if there is, if you have any question or anything, Twitter is the best. But then there's also email. My website is sarasoueidan.com.
Thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's some great stuff on SVG and CSS, and looking forward to seeing your next trip, to see where you're going and what you're speaking about.
There's actually going to be the Net Awards in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, you're always nominated for something.
No, I'm not. A while back when I got the email from Simon St. Laurent, he sent me an email. He told me, hey, he didn't even mention my name in the email. It was like, hi, you won a web platform award, and I was wondering if you could come, to take it in person. Yeah, so I said no, I couldn't possibly accept it. Exactly. So I couldn't possibly do it in person. So the first thing that I replied with when I read what email was that email was, are you sure that email was sent to me and that it wasn't just sent to me by mistake? So he replied with, yeah, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned your name. You did win a web platform award. I had no idea. Literally none, zero. So, and then a couple of months after that, I was nominated for 2 Net Awards, and that was again a surprise. And then I was shortlisted for both of them, which makes me happy, really.
Well, you get out there and you do the work, and this is stuff too that's not easy because of the lack of browser support for a lot of the extended features, right? So, I mean, this is something that we all need somebody who takes on that. To be the hero for that particular technology. And I think you do that well, and you've been writing for Codrops. Mm-hmm. So,
well, I appreciate the appreciation. Seriously, sometimes just a thank you tweet from someone could make my entire day. And it's sometimes tweets like these and people telling me that they were able to solve their problems by reading my articles. It's stuff like that keeps me want to write more.
Excellent. And is there any projects and things that people can help you with?
I really don't like this word, but sometimes I think it's just the perfect word to describe it. It's just keep nagging about those features. Keep telling browser vendors about them. We need them. We want them. Just push them forward. That's the best thing that anyone could help with.
We can do this on WebKit's bugs. We can do this on Chromium and Firefox, and we can use user voice for Microsoft. Mm-hmm. So we'll post a few bugs.
And write articles. If there's a feature that you want to use or that would be useful for a practical use case that you're working on, write about it, because you need to get the word out. Otherwise, it's just not going to get there.
Yeah, it's very true.
Sara, it's great stuff.
Thank you.
Really, thank you for coming on. You are so knowledgeable on the topic.
Thank you.
And frankly, I'm just so happy when I can draw a circle and in SVG, and you do so much more. So thank you so much for coming on. It's great stuff.
It's good being here. Thank you for having me.
This has been episode 58, and we'll talk to you soon.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at +the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at @eIsaacson
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.